The most beautiful woman in the world lies lifeless in her bedroom. Her hand still clutches the telephone, as if trying to make one final desperate call. The year is 1962, and Marilyn Monroe is gone. But what really happened that night would shake the foundations of American power and reveal secrets that the government desperately wanted to keep buried forever. Before we dive into video, please subscribe our channel until August 5th in 1962, the world woke up to devastating news. Marilyn Monroe had died from an overdose of barbiturates. The coroner ruled it a probable suicide. The case was closed within days. America mourned and moved on. But beneath this convenient narrative lay a web of conspiracy and murder that connected directly to the highest offices in the land. Marilyn Monroe was not just any Hollywood star. She was an icon who had captured the imagination of an entire generation. Born Norma Jean Mortensen in 1926, she had risen from poverty and a troubled childhood to become the most recognized face on the planet. Her platinum blonde hair and breathtaking beauty made her a symbol of American glamour. But behind the dazzling smile was a woman far more intelligent and complex than the blonde bombshell image she portrayed on screen. By 1962, Marilyn had reached a crossroads in her life. Her marriages had failed. Her mental health was deteriorating. She struggled with addiction to pills and alcohol. Studios found her increasingly difficult to work with due to her chronic lateness and emotional instability. Yet she remained one of the most powerful women in Hollywood. She had her own production company. She commanded huge salaries. She had connections that reached into the very heart of American political power. Those connections would ultimately seal her fate. Marilyn Monroe was having affairs with both President John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy, who served as Attorney General. These were not rumors or tabloid speculation. These were documented facts that the Kennedy family worked desperately to keep hidden from public view. The brothers had become entangled with Marilyn in a way that threatened to destroy their political dynasty. The affair with JFK had begun earlier and was relatively brief. The president was known for his numerous extramarital relationships, and Marilyn was simply one among many. But she had fallen deeply in love with him. She believed he would leave his wife Jackie and marry her. She even spoke openly to friends about becoming First Lady. This level of delusion and her increasing emotional instability made her a liability that the Kennedys could not afford. When JFK grew tired of her and cut off contact, Marilyn turned to his brother Bobby. Robert Kennedy was different from his womanizing brother. He was more serious and dedicated to his work as Attorney General. But he too fell under Marilyn's spell and began an affair that was even more dangerous than the one with the president. Bobby started visiting Marilyn at her home in Los Angeles. He made phone calls to her that could be traced. He was less careful than his brother had been. By the summer of 1962, Marilyn Monroe had become unhinged. She called the White House repeatedly trying to reach JFK. She threatened to hold a press conference and reveal everything about her relationships with both brothers. She kept a diary where she recorded intimate details of her conversations with the Kennedys, including sensitive information about government operations, and even details about the Bay of Pigs invasion and plans regarding Cuba. This was beyond scandalous. This was a matter of national security. The Kennedy brothers faced a crisis that could end their political careers and damage American interests during the height of the Cold War. They needed Marilyn silenced. Some researchers believe they needed her dead. What happened on the night of August 4th and the early morning hours of August 5th would be covered up by a conspiracy that involved the Los Angeles Police Department and the FBI and possibly the CIA and members of the Kennedy administration itself. The official timeline of that night has never made sense. According to the story given to police, Marilyn's housekeeper, Eunice Murray, woke up around 3 a.m. and noticed a light on in Marilyn's bedroom. She found the door locked and called Marilyn's psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson. He arrived and broke the window to get inside, where he found Marilyn dead on her bed. He then called Marilyn's personal physician, Dr. Hyman Engelberg, who pronounced her dead. The police were not called until 4:25 a.m., but this timeline falls apart under scrutiny. Neighbors reported seeing lights on at Marilyn's house much earlier in the evening. They reported hearing shouting. One neighbor claimed to have heard a woman screaming. Phone records show that Marilyn made several calls that evening and received calls as well. Yet these records were confiscated by authorities and have never been made public. What was said in those calls? Who was she talking to? Even more suspicious was the presence of Robert Kennedy in Los Angeles that day. For decades, the Kennedy family denied that Bobby was anywhere near California when Marilyn died, but multiple witnesses have since come forward to place him in Los Angeles on August 4th. Peter Lawford, who was married to the Kennedy sister, Patricia, and who was close friends with Marilyn, claimed that Bobby had visited Marilyn's house that afternoon. There had been a terrible argument. Bobby had told Marilyn to stop calling and to forget about the Kennedy family. Marilyn had become hysterical. According to some accounts, Bobby returned to Marilyn's house later that evening. This time he was not alone. He brought with him several other men. What happened during this visit remains unclear, but some witnesses claim they heard shouting and the sounds of a struggle. When these men left, Marilyn was either dead or dying. The subsequent hours were spent staging the scene to look like a suicide. The physical evidence at the scene raises even more questions. Marilyn's body was found lying face down on her bed, in a position that investigators later described as too perfect and posed. Her hand held the telephone, but there was no one on the other end of the line. The room had been cleaned. There were pill bottles on the nightstand, but the large number of pills she supposedly ingested should have left residue in her stomach. The autopsy found none. The autopsy itself was highly irregular. It was performed by Dr. Thomas Noguchi, who later became famous as the coroner to the stars. Noguchi found high levels of barbiturates in Marilyn's blood and liver, but found no traces of pills in her stomach or digestive system. This is virtually impossible if she had swallowed the massive dose that killed her. The only explanation is that the drugs were introduced into her body by some other means. Noguchi noted bruising on Marilyn's lower body and signs that suggested the drugs may have been administered through an enema or injection. This finding pointed to murder, not suicide. But the conclusion was never officially changed. The Los Angeles County District Attorney investigated the case in 1982, and while acknowledging the inconsistencies, ultimately decided not to reopen it. The official cause of death remained acute barbiturate poisoning, with the mode of death listed as probable suicide. The case was closed again, but the evidence of a cover-up is overwhelming. Marilyn's house was bugged. This has been confirmed by multiple sources, including former CIA operatives and mob figures. The legendary Teamster boss Jimmy Hoffa had ordered surveillance on Marilyn's home, hoping to gather damaging information about the Kennedys. Hoffa hated Robert Kennedy, who as Attorney General was prosecuting him for corruption. Tapes were made of conversations in Marilyn's house, including her fights with Bobby Kennedy. These tapes have never been released, but people who claim to have heard them say they contain explosive material. The FBI was also monitoring Marilyn. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover kept files on anyone with connections to the Kennedys. Hoover had his own reasons for wanting dirt on the Kennedy brothers. He used blackmail and secret information to maintain his power in Washington. Documents released years later show that the FBI did indeed have a file on Marilyn, and that it contained references to her relationships with high-ranking political figures. Most of the file remains classified to this day. On the night Marilyn died, there was unusual activity around her home. An ambulance was called to the house hours before the official time of death was reported. The ambulance driver later claimed that when he arrived, Marilyn was still alive but barely breathing. He said she was taken to the hospital, but then brought back to her house. He was told to forget everything he had seen. His company records of that call mysteriously disappeared. The LAPD detective assigned to investigate Marilyn's death was told to close the case quickly. He later admitted that he was pressured from above to rule it a suicide, despite evidence that pointed in other directions. Files from the investigation went missing. Photographs from the scene disappeared. Key witnesses were never properly interviewed. It was a textbook case of official corruption and cover-up. Eunice Murray, the housekeeper, changed her story multiple times over the years. In later interviews, she admitted that Robert Kennedy had been at the house that day. She admitted that the timeline she gave police was false. She said she had been told what to say and had followed instructions. She implied that powerful people had orchestrated the cover-up, but she never named names. She took the full truth to her grave when she died in 1994. Peter Lawford, who was probably the last person to speak with Marilyn before she died, also gave conflicting accounts. He claimed Marilyn called him that evening and sounded strange and groggy. She supposedly said goodbye in a way that alarmed him, but he did not call the police or go to check on her. Instead, he called her psychiatrist, Dr. Greenson, and his manager, and possibly others. Some believe Lawford was involved in cleaning up the scene before police arrived. He was certainly involved in protecting the Kennedy family interests. Dr. Greenson and Dr. Engelberg, the two doctors most closely involved with Marilyn's care, also behaved suspiciously. Greenson had been treating Marilyn for depression and anxiety. He had prescribed her numerous medications. He was at her house frequently and had become deeply enmeshed in her personal life. Some believe he was monitoring her for the Kennedys. Others think he may have been the one who administered the fatal dose. Engelberg, who provided Marilyn with prescriptions for barbiturates, also had questions to answer about why he gave such powerful drugs to someone so clearly unstable. The physical evidence tells a story of violence, not suicide. Beyond the bruising noted in the autopsy, there were other signs of a struggle. Marilyn's stomach contents and certain tissue samples from the autopsy disappeared and were never properly analyzed. The toxicology report had inconsistencies that experts have questioned for decades. The fact that her stomach was empty, despite supposedly ingesting dozens of pills, remains the most damning evidence against the suicide theory. Some researchers believe Marilyn was held down and forcibly given a fatal enema containing barbiturates. This would explain the high levels of drugs in her system without any residue in her digestive tract. It would explain the bruising. It would explain why she appeared to have been posed after death. This was not a woman who took her own life. This was a woman who was murdered because she knew too much and threatened to talk. The question of who actually killed her remains open. The Kennedy brothers almost certainly did not do it themselves, but they had resources and connections to people who could. The CIA had developed sophisticated methods for making murders look like suicides or accidents. They had done it before in foreign countries as part of Cold War operations. Could they have done it in Los Angeles to protect the president? The mob also had reasons to want Marilyn dead. She was involved with Sam Giancana, the powerful Chicago mob boss who himself had connections to the CIA and the Kennedys. The relationships between organized crime and the government in the early 1960s were complex and murky. The mob had helped JFK win the 1960 election. They had worked with the CIA on plots to kill Fidel Castro. But Bobby Kennedy, as Attorney General, was prosecuting mob figures and breaking up their operations. Marilyn's death could have been a mob hit, designed to embarrass the Kennedys or to send them a message. What we know for certain is that Marilyn Monroe died under suspicious circumstances. We know that powerful people had motives to silence her. We know that evidence was destroyed and witnesses were intimidated. We know that the official investigation was a sham designed to cover up the truth rather than reveal it. We know that files remain classified more than 60 years after her death. Why would documents about a supposed suicide still be kept secret? The tragedy of Marilyn Monroe is not just that she died young at only 36 years old. The tragedy is that she was used and discarded by powerful men who saw her as nothing more than a plaything. When she became inconvenient, she was eliminated. Her death was then used to sell papers and create legends. The truth about what happened to her was buried under layers of lies and official denials. In the decades since her death, Marilyn has become more famous than ever. She remains the ultimate symbol of Hollywood glamour and tragedy, but behind the icon was a real woman who struggled with pain and loneliness, and who desperately wanted to be loved and respected. She tried to educate herself and be taken seriously. She fought for control over her career and her image. She was far more than the dumb blonde character she played in movies. Her involvement with the Kennedys showed both her ambition and her naivety. She believed that these powerful men truly cared for her. She believed she could be part of their world. She did not understand that to them she was always expendable. When she threatened to expose their secrets, they moved to protect themselves. Her life meant nothing compared to their power and prestige. The cover-up of her murder is one of the great crimes of the 20th century. It involved the corruption of law enforcement and the medical examiner and the press. It showed how justice could be bought and sold. It demonstrated that there was one set of rules for the powerful and another for everyone else. Marilyn Monroe was not a suicide. She was a murder victim whose killers were never brought to justice. Today, when people think of Marilyn, they think of the white dress blowing up over the subway grate. They think of her singing "Happy Birthday" to President Kennedy in that breathy voice. They think of the beauty and the glamour. Few think about the darkness that surrounded her death. Few question the official story. But the truth is there for anyone willing to look past the legend and examine the facts. The facts tell us that Marilyn Monroe knew too much. She had become involved with men who operated at the highest levels of power. She had learned secrets that could damage national security. She had threatened to go public with information that would destroy careers and reputations. For this, she paid with her life. The method was brutal. The cover-up was efficient. The killers walked free. More than 60 years have passed and still the full truth has not emerged. Key documents remain locked away. Witnesses have died. The trail has gone cold. We may never know exactly who gave the order or who administered the fatal dose. But we can know that Marilyn Monroe did not kill herself. We can know that her death was darker and more sinister than the public was told. We can know that justice was denied, and that her memory deserves better than the lies we have been fed. The story of Marilyn Monroe is a cautionary tale about fame and power and the price of getting too close to the sun. She wanted to be loved by the world, and she achieved that goal. But the love of millions of fans could not protect her from the ruthless men who saw her as a threat. In the end, she died alone and afraid in her bedroom at a house on 5th Helena Drive in Los Angeles. The last hours of her life were filled with terror and violence. The truth of what happened was immediately suppressed. We owe it to her memory to keep asking questions and demanding answers. We owe it to her to reject the comfortable lies and face the uncomfortable truth. Marilyn Monroe was murdered. The case should be reopened. The classified files should be released. The American people deserve to know what their government did and why it was covered up for so long. Until that happens, the ghost of Marilyn Monroe will haunt us, reminding us that even the brightest stars can be extinguished by those who operate in the shadows. Her death represents everything wrong with how power operates in America. It shows how easily the truth can be manipulated and how thoroughly a crime can be concealed when the right people are involved. It reveals the dark underbelly of the glamorous world of politics and Hollywood, where human lives are merely pawns in larger games of power and influence. Marilyn Monroe deserved better in life, and she deserves better in death. She deserves the truth. The investigation into her death was closed, but the questions remain open. How deep did the conspiracy go? How many people were involved in the murder and the cover-up? What exactly was recorded on those surveillance tapes? What is in the files that remain classified? These questions may never be fully answered, but they must continue to be asked. The legacy of Marilyn Monroe is not just her films and photographs. It is also the mystery and injustice of her death. As we look back across the decades, we can see how the official narrative falls apart under scrutiny. We can see the holes in the story and the evidence that was ignored or destroyed. We can see the pattern of powerful people protecting themselves at the expense of truth and justice. The death of Marilyn Monroe is darker than we realized because it reveals fundamental truths about how power works and how little value is placed on individual human life when it conflicts with the interests of the elite. The red diary that Marilyn kept has never been found. Multiple people saw this diary in the days before her death. It was a small red book where she wrote down everything. Friends reported that she recorded conversations with the Kennedy brothers in detail. She wrote about government secrets she had learned. She wrote about her fears that she was being watched and followed. After her death, this diary vanished. Police never found it at the scene. No one has seen it since. What happened to it? Who took it and why? The answer is obvious to anyone willing to see it. The diary was removed from Marilyn's house on the night she died. It was taken either before or immediately after her murder. It contained evidence that would have pointed directly to the Kennedys and exposed the true nature of their relationship with Marilyn. It contained state secrets that could have damaged American interests. It had to disappear. And it did. Several investigators who have looked into Marilyn's death have reported being threatened or warned off. One detective who worked on the 1982 review of the case said he received anonymous phone calls telling him to stop digging. A journalist who wrote about the Kennedy connection had his office broken into and his files stolen. Another researcher claims she was followed after interviewing witnesses. The message was clear. Some people did not want the truth about Marilyn's death to come out. Even decades later, when most of the principals are dead, the secrecy continues. When documents are released under Freedom of Information requests, they arrive heavily redacted, with entire pages blacked out. When files are declassified, key sections are missing. The official explanation is always national security or privacy concerns. But what national security interest is served by hiding the truth about a death that occurred in 1962? What privacy is being protected when all the major figures are long dead? The answer is that powerful institutions are protecting themselves and their reputations. The FBI does not want to admit it helped cover up a murder. The CIA does not want questions asked about whether its operatives were involved. The Kennedy family does not want the legacy of JFK and Bobby tarnished by association with a sordid killing. So the lies continue, and the truth remains buried. What makes Marilyn's story even darker is how she was treated in the days and weeks before her death. She was isolated and controlled by the very people who were supposed to be caring for her. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Greenson, had taken over nearly every aspect of her life. He controlled who she saw and what she did. He prescribed the drugs that she became dependent on. He even moved his own family members into her house under the guise of helping her. This level of control is not therapy. It is manipulation. Some researchers believe Greenson was working with the Kennedys to keep Marilyn drugged and manageable. Others think he had his own motives related to his desire for fame and proximity to a star. Whatever his reasons, his treatment of Marilyn in her final months was unethical at best and criminal at worst. He turned her into a prisoner in her own home, dependent on pills and unable to make her own decisions. The night Marilyn died, she made several phone calls to friends. In these calls, she sounded frightened and confused. She told one friend that she felt like something bad was going to happen. She told another that people were trying to hurt her. These calls are documented, but they were never properly investigated. No one asked who she thought was threatening her or why she was so afraid. The focus was immediately put on her supposed mental instability rather than on the very real danger she was in. Marilyn Monroe spent her last day alive in fear and distress. She had the argument with Robert Kennedy in the afternoon. She made desperate phone calls trying to reach people who could help her. She was visited by multiple people throughout the evening, including some whose identities have never been confirmed. By the time midnight came around, she was either already dead or in the process of being killed. The woman who had brought joy to millions died in terror and pain. The immediate aftermath of her death was carefully orchestrated. Before the police were called, the scene was cleaned and arranged. The people who would tell the official story were coached on what to say. The evidence that would contradict the suicide narrative was removed or destroyed. By the time detectives arrived, there was nothing left that would point to murder. The cover-up was already complete. In the hours after the announcement of Marilyn's death, journalists descended on her house. They took photographs and interviewed neighbors and tried to piece together what had happened. But they were fed the official line. A troubled star had taken her own life. It was tragic, but not surprising given her history of emotional problems. The story was written before the investigation even began. The conclusion was predetermined. The press in 1962 was different from today. There was more deference to authority and more willingness to accept official explanations. There was also more willingness to protect powerful figures like the Kennedys. Journalists knew about JFK's affairs, but did not report them. They suspected that something was wrong with Marilyn's death, but did not push too hard for answers. The public got a sanitized version of events that bore little resemblance to reality. But even in 1962, there were skeptics. Some journalists and investigators smelled a cover-up from the beginning. They noted the inconsistencies in the timeline. They questioned the suicide ruling. They tried to dig deeper, but they were blocked at every turn. Sources dried up. Witnesses refused to talk. Officials stonewalled. The truth was locked away, and those who sought it were frustrated. Marilyn Monroe died on August 5th in 1962, but the circumstances of her death remain a living scandal that refuses to be buried. Each new revelation and each declassified document adds another piece to the puzzle. The picture that emerges is not of a troubled woman who took her own life, but of a victim who was silenced because she knew too much. This is the truth that has been hidden for over 6 decades. This is the darkness at the heart of the Marilyn Monroe story. And this is why her death continues to fascinate and disturb us even today. The final chapter of Marilyn Monroe's life is written in the shadows and secrets of powerful men who valued their own interests above human life. It is a story of betrayal and murder and corruption. It is a story that shows the worst of American power and the lengths to which the elite will go to protect themselves. Marilyn deserved justice. She deserved truth. She received neither. And until the full story is finally told, her spirit will never rest, and her death will continue to haunt the American conscience as a reminder of how far we have fallen from our ideals.